In Tehran, the bombs started exploding in the early hours of June 13th. Israel's preemptive strikes against Iran, dubbed Operation Rising Lion, had begun. Over the next 24 hours, Israel hit multiple locations: Karaj, Isfahan, Tabriz, Hamadan, Piran Shah, and perhaps most importantly, the Natanz nuclear facility. Israel's goal was clear: decimate Iran's nuclear capabilities. But this early operation in the Israel-Iran war was just the beginning. The real firestorm begins now, as both countries assess their next steps, and the specter of US involvement looms over the emerging Middle East crisis. Operation Rising Lion represented a devastating assault against Iran's internal power base. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, Israel sent 200 fighter jets, most of them F-35s carrying standoff munitions, into Iranian territory to conduct a series of precision strikes against 100 nuclear and military targets. Nothing was safe. While nuclear sites seemed to be the priority, Israel also conducted strikes deep in Iran's cities that were aimed at taking out key military and nuclear officials. The Jerusalem Post reported a day after the attack that the Israel Defense Force, or IDF, believes it has taken out 9 of Iran's senior scientists and nuclear experts, 2 of which the IDF claims were actively advancing Iran's push to obtain a nuclear weapon. Among the dead were also several key military officials who served as advisors to Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Iran was shell-shocked. In a 24-hour series of strikes, Israel had tried to decapitate its leadership structure while overwhelming some of its key military facilities and munitions. Drones also played a role, according to CSIS. They were used to saturate Iran's aerial defenses, which had already been sabotaged by Israel's Mossad agents with decoys. That saturation made it even harder for Iran to defend itself against the devastating Israeli strikes. The Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, highlights the importance of what came before the strikes. The opening phase of Operation Rising Lion, it says, began with a series of covert Mossad operators taking out high-value targets in Iran using strike drones and anti-tank munitions. They paved the way for the aerial forces that would come later, showcasing how Iran's reliance on ground-based air defense systems purchased from Russia wasn't enough to safeguard its most valuable military and nuclear assets. Iran responded. It had to. In an effort to showcase its own strength and perhaps offer a deterrent to Israel, it spent the last few days firing loitering munitions and ballistic missiles at Israel. The country's immediate response was to send 100 slow-moving drones into Israel, though most of these were handled relatively easily by Israel's air defenses. That was a panicked response, an effort to offer something in the wake of an overwhelming attack. The responses since have been far more dangerous. On June 15th, the BBC reported that Iran had launched a fresh wave of attacks on Israel, striking the north and center of the country with ballistic missiles and loitering munitions that are believed to have killed 4 people near Haifa. On June 18th, the Jewish News Syndicate reported that Iran launched 2 waves of ballistic missiles at Israel overnight. The first of these barrages began at 12:40 a.m. local time and saw Iran rattle off 15 missiles. A second salvo came about 40 minutes later and involved 10 missiles. Most were intercepted, but at least one touched down in central Israel, hitting a parking lot where it destroyed several vehicles and caused a powerful fire. By June 18th, the Middle East Monitor was reporting that 585 people had been killed in Iran, with a further 1,300 being injured in Israel's strikes. Israel has a much lower death toll so far. 24 have been killed by Iran's response, with several hundreds being injured, the Monitor claims. What we have here is far more than a tit-for-tat series of strikes. This isn't 2 countries batting a handful of missiles and drones back and forth to send warnings to one another. It's Israel and Iran at war. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is already telling his people that they need to strap themselves in for a long conflict, claims the Caspian Report YouTube channel. It also comes as no coincidence that Netanyahu launched Operation Rising Lion mere hours after a pair of confidence votes in his government that almost spelled the end of his reign. On June 12th, Netanyahu's government just about scraped through the second of those votes after reaching a deal with one of Israel's ultra-Orthodox parties, says Al Jazeera. Hours later, the bombs started falling on Iran. Then there's the US. It's gone from taking no position in the budding war to creating an atmosphere of uncertainty over whether it's going to be involved or not. In the immediate aftermath of the initial Operation Rising Lion strikes, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio was quick to deny any US involvement. "We are not involved in strikes against Iran, and our top priority is protecting American forces in the region. Let me be clear, Iran should not target US interests or personnel," the BBC reported Rubio as saying on June 13th. But what seemed like an expression of non-involvement, along with a veiled threat to Iran not to do anything reckless that would force a US response, has only grown more ambiguous in the days since. Now nobody knows if the US is planning to get involved. And during a June 18th event on the White House lawn that saw him install a pair of new flagpoles, US President Donald Trump fed that ambiguity. "You don't know that I'm going to even do it," Trump told one reporter when asked about a US response in Iran. "I may do it, I may not do it. Nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you this, Iran's got a lot of trouble, and they want to negotiate." Trump is referring to negotiations that were ongoing with Iran over the latter's nuclear program. Trump has been clear about his position, says the White House website. Time and time again, he has stated that Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. On June 16th, he said, "I want to see no nuclear weapon in Iran, and we're well on our way to making sure that happens." Again, ambiguity. In the months leading up to Israel's strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, the US and Iran were talking. Now, nobody knows. Is a deal even possible? While a US ally is hitting the very nuclear sites the US wants to step down, and Trump is allowing people to consider the possibility that the US could join in on those strikes. It's difficult to say. What everyone knows for certain is the powder keg that has been forming in the Middle East for years has finally ignited. Israel and Iran are embroiled in the first stages of a war that could get worse by the day, which makes negotiations difficult and leaves us to ponder the obvious question: what comes next? Some analysts believe that Israel's initial strikes against Iran had a clear purpose: to set the stage for a series of follow-up operations. The first wave of attacks reportedly focused on radars, air defenses, aircraft and control towers, critical assets that would weaken Iran's ability to defend against future strikes. While media coverage has largely centered on nuclear facilities and high-profile targets, it's worth remembering that Operation Rising Lion designated 100 targets. Many of these were likely facilities housing the very systems mentioned earlier. The strategy appears to be sequential. With air defenses and command infrastructure weakened, Israel's next strikes are expected to shift towards secondary targets of strategic and economic value, such as ports, refineries, and missile production centers. An approach is becoming clear. Israel first hit key nuclear and military sites while trying to decapitate Iran's leadership. Next, it's going to hit Iran in the pocketbook. With the country in disarray, it'll use its secondary strikes to create economic and domestic pressure on a leadership that is already feeling the heat. That's not to say that Iran's nuclear ambitions are off the table as a target. The problem Israel faces now is that the munitions it has available to it aren't capable of taking Iran's nuclear facilities offline forever. Damage can be done. We see that in Natanz, where the BBC reports that Israel has likely destroyed the centrifuges Iran was using to enrich uranium to 60%, which is only 30% away from making the material weapons grade. However, there are other sites, notably the Fordow uranium enrichment facility that's built into a mountain and is believed to extend up to 295 feet underground. Israel's bombs can't hit that facility, at least they can't hit it where it hurts, only being capable of causing superficial damage to the protective structures outside the facility and the tunnels leading into Fordow. To take Fordow offline permanently, Israel would need access to US-made B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and the 14-ton GBU-57 bombs they're capable of carrying. Sky News says that the GBU-57 bomb is the only one capable of destroying Fordow. Its 30,000-pound weight means it's capable of delivering the sheer kinetic force needed to reach targets buried deep underground. Even then, several will be needed. A single GBU-57 can penetrate as deep as 200 feet, which isn't quite enough to reach Fordow's main halls, but several, launched in succession and in the same location, would be enough to do the job. Israel doesn't have these bombs or the stealth bombers needed to use them. The US does. Again, the specter of US involvement looms over what comes next in the Iran-Israel conflict. If the goal is to take Iran's nuclear facilities offline for good, as seems to be the case for Israel and is definitely the case for the US, then Netanyahu may be able to convince Trump to let him use American bombers. Trump, on the other hand, may prefer the negotiation tactics he was previously using to achieve the same result. The only clear thing is that Israel needs more force than it has in its arsenal to take out Iran's nuclear facilities forever. But maybe that isn't the real goal. Israel has talked about dismantling Iran's nuclear ambitions as a key goal. Operation Rising Lion started mere hours after the publication of an International Atomic Energy Agency or IAEA report that formally declared Iran in breach of its non-proliferation objectives for the first time in 2 decades, the BBC says. The IAEA says that among Iran's many failures was a lack of answers about undeclared nuclear materials and its enrichment of uranium to 60% purity. Israel hit Iran a day later. Still, that may have been a smokescreen for what Israel really wants to achieve: regime change in Iran. That certainly seems to be on Netanyahu's mind. In an interview with Fox News on June 15th, Netanyahu talked about how weakening Iran's defenses and causing so many issues with its nuclear plants is all designed to hurt the country's leadership. Netanyahu characterized Iran's government as very weak and claimed that 80% of the people would throw these theological thugs out. Perhaps we're seeing hints at what Israel's ultimate goal is here. The objective may not be to outright destroy Iran. Instead, it's to destroy Iran's leaders. Whether that's done directly by Israel through its strikes or is achieved through an uprising inspired by Israel is immaterial, at least to Netanyahu. The goal is to make it happen. And even the goal of the campaign Israel is waging seems to suggest that. The New Arab reports that Israel has confirmed that the name Rising Lion is directly linked to Iran's pre-revolution Shah flag, which is sending a clear message from Israel to the Iranian people: you were free of your leaders once before, and it's now time to rise against them. Whether that will actually happen is up for debate. It's hard to even gain support for an uprising when your cities are being pelted with Israeli munitions, never mind conducting any sort of organized activity against Iran's government. Could this mean we're going to see Israel scale back the intensity of its attacks and launch a propaganda campaign to convince Iran's people to do the rest of the job? It's possible. For as devastating as Israel's attacks have been so far, it can't keep them up forever. Munitions are finite. Eventually, Israel will have to slow down for its own sake, even if not as a tactic to force regime change. Still, getting rid of Iran's leaders seems to be the ultimate goal. As for Iran, it may be mirroring Israel's goal. That's according to Caspian Report, which says that Iran may be gunning for Netanyahu now that it knows that he's only just scraped through the previously mentioned confidence votes by the skin of his teeth. Tehran's strategy is also regime change, but through more legal means, the channel says. The Iranians know they can't change Netanyahu's mind, but they might just be able to collapse his government by building up domestic pressure and triggering a vote of no confidence. Right now, there's only one way for Iran to do this in the absence of any diplomatic measures: hurt Israel as much as possible to demonstrate to the country's people that Netanyahu has dragged them into a war rather than a one-sided assault against Iran. That's where the missile strikes Iran is currently launching against Israel come into play. Iran's goal, at least for the next few weeks, could be to launch a war of attrition against Israel's air defenses, which include the much-vaunted Iron Dome, along with David's Sling and the Arrow. Combined, those three systems offer long, medium, and short-range defenses against incoming aerial threats. However, as with Israel's attack munitions, the missiles they use are finite and expensive. Iran's approach may be to continuously bombard those defenses until Israel runs out of missiles. It certainly has the stockpiles to try. According to the Institute for Science and International Security, Iran builds long-range Shahid drones capable of reaching Israel at a rate of about 20 per workday. As long as its domestic production lines remain intact, Tehran can keep pumping them out to reinforce its already substantial inventory. Damage wouldn't be the goal, at least not initially. Iran would instead use its drones to force Israel to burn through its air defenses until there's nothing left, after which more Shahids will start touching down on their targets. Then there are Iran's missiles. The International Institute for Strategic Studies says that the US Central Command believed Iran had an arsenal of around 3,000 missiles in 2022, though Israel placed the figure at a more conservative 2,000. Either way, that's a lot of missiles. Not all will be capable of reaching Israel, of course, but these missiles carry more destructive power than drones. If Iran can succeed in taking Israel's air defenses offline through sheer strike volume, it may not be long before more of these missiles are touching down in Israel's residential areas. The pressure on Netanyahu would build, and Iran might just be able to force regime change, assuming Israel doesn't force the same in Iran first. Escalation could also come via Iran's proxies, which include the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hamas in Palestine. However, Iran may have more trouble relying on those groups than it would relying on itself. That's a fairly recent development. For years, Iran has been using those proxies to exert its influence over the Middle East. However, it may have overplayed its hand in recent years by causing those proxies to do enough damage to force other countries to get involved. The most obvious example comes from the actions of Hamas in October 2023 that sparked a full-blown war between the group and Israel. The Guardian points out that Israel has massively weakened Hamas in Palestine, with separate campaigns waged against Hezbollah having a similar effect. Both proxies are weakened. Iran may no longer be able to rely on them to apply the type of pressure it wants to apply to force regime change in Israel. The Houthis in Yemen have also been significantly weakened. Throughout much of 2024, that group was carrying out attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, reportedly as a response to Israeli aggression in Gaza. Those attacks were paused when a ceasefire was declared between Israel and Hamas earlier in 2025, though the Houthis threatened to start them again when the ceasefire collapsed. This time it was the US that responded. Starting in March, the US engaged in a nearly 2-month-long campaign of daily airstrikes in Yemen, designed to take out the Houthi leadership and its key military facilities, which included ports and drone manufacturing plants. By the end of the campaign, the US had launched 33 strikes and, according to Air Wars, killed 224 civilians, along with the many Houthi targets the US claimed to have destroyed. Still, the pressure paid off. The Houthis backed down, and they, like Hamas and Hezbollah, are unlikely to be a supporting force for Iran in its battle against Israel. Iran does have the option of attacking elsewhere, Caspian Report points out. Maybe it could hit oil fields in Saudi Arabia, for instance, or the US military bases that surround its country, but doing so would be unwise. The US is still ambiguous about whether it wants to get involved. Though such strikes could cause Iran's Middle East neighbors to put pressure on Israel to stop because they want to avoid collateral damage, they'd also force a response from the US. Iran doesn't want that. The US entering the fray would escalate the conflict with Israel to a point that Iran is unlikely able to handle. The only other form of deterrence Iran seems to have available is to prove the US and Israel right all along. Testing a working nuclear weapon might be enough to stop Israel in its tracks. But that may not be possible right now, given the scale of the strikes conducted against Iran's nuclear facilities. According to Iran Watch, it would have only taken Iran up to 2 weeks to enrich the 370 to 593 pounds of 60% enriched uranium to 90% to create up to 8 small nuclear weapons before Israel's strikes began. That's assuming Iran has delivery vectors and the technology to actually use that enriched uranium as it needs to be used. Those timescales will have been drastically altered now that Israel is hitting Iran's nuclear facilities. Still, the worst-case scenario may be that Operation Rising Lion is what pushes Iran's leadership over the edge. The desperate creation of a nuclear weapon may be the only option they have left, and if that's the case, the real firestorm created by the Iran-Israel war could turn nuclear. If Iran's tactic is to overwhelm Israel's aerial defenses, it may have a shock coming. Israel's trio of air defense systems may soon be joined by a revolutionary new laser weapon that is combat-tested and almost ready to go. Find out everything there is to know about that weapon in our video.